Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Sandala. I'm Programming and Outreach Specialist here at Library Link NJ. I'm thrilled to introduce our Summer Scares authors, Djèlí Clark, KG Campbell, Suzanne Walker, and Wendy Xu. Djèlí Clark is the author of the novel A Master of Jinn and the award-winning novellas Ring Shout and A Black God's Drums, among others. He resides in a small Edwardian castle in New England with his wife, daughters, and pet dragon, who resembles a Boston Terrier. Fen, I need more information about that, by the way. His latest book, A Benny Song, was published by Macmillan in July 2023. KG Campbell was born in Kenya, but raised in Scotland. He graduated with a master's degree in art history from the University of Edinburgh. After trying on several careers, Keith eventually returned to his early passion of writing and illustrating stories. He's now a full-time author and illustrator living in California. Keith, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Suzanne Walker is a Chicago-based writer and editor. She is co-creator of the critically acclaimed graphic novel Mooncakes. She has spoken at numerous conventions on a variety of topics, ranging from disability representation in sci-fi fantasy to comics collaboration. You can often find her posting pictures of her cat and chronicling her long short adventures. I need to know more about that too, Suzanne, by the way.
We can have a show and tell later.
Yes, please, definitely. Wendy Xu is a best-selling award-nominated Brooklyn-based illustrator and comics artist. She is co-creator of the middle-grade fantasy graphic novel Tide Song and co-creator of Mooncakes. Her work has been featured on Catapult and Tor.com, among other places. And so excited, her most recent graphic novel is The Infinity Particle, published by HarperCollins in August 2023. Moderator Becky Spradford is a librarian and New Jersey native, yay, now living in Illinois. She runs a critically acclaimed RA training blog, RA for All. She is also the author of the Reader's Advisory Guide to Horror 3rd edition. Have to show up my copy, please pick up a copy, it's wonderful. And a proud member of the Horror Writers Association and serves as organizer of their annual Librarians Day. Becky, thank you for being here and for stepping in and moderating.
You are all welcome. Yes, I am pinch hitting for Conrad, who some of you saw last year as well when we did this program. Thank you to all the authors for being here today. I am going to start, though, by sharing my screen and talking a little more about Summer Scares. And Stephanie is going to put the URL in the chat that you can access the free programming guide. So I just want to spend about 5 minutes before we get started explaining the program to everyone. And we had some nice new additions this year as well. First of all, in terms of additions to the program, this is the lovely programming guide. And it is made by the Springfield Greene County Library District, which Conrad Stump works for and is on our committee. In fact, here is our lovely committee. Me, Conrad, and a few other people. This year, our spokesperson was Daniel Krause. So basically how Summer Scares works is every single year we get together and actually our first meeting for Summer Scares 2024 with our new yet to be announced spokesperson is starting next week, actually, which is very exciting. And we will announce that person to you on the 31st of October. But basically what we do is, and news for you with your spokesperson next year, the person is not far from New Jersey, so we'll be available for in-person. I put the email on how to book people in the chat, but it's libraries@horror.org, just so you know. Anyway, so we have a person every year. This year was Daniel Krause, who was one of our original Summer Scares authors from the first year. He's also had the cover of the New York Times Book Review this week with his book that came out yesterday called Whale Fall. And he did a really great job for us because he's also a former librarian. I first met him when he worked at Booklist with me. And every year we get together over a series of meetings from the late summer until December. And we basically discuss titles. So here were all of this year's titles. And it's hard to fit it all on the screen at once, but I will kind of go up and show you them. What we do is we discuss titles, and you'll notice none of them are brand new. We go out of our way to pick titles that are 2 to 8 years old so that they are backlists. So we know that you have them. We also go out of our way to make sure we pick books that are completely different and tell different types of stories. So in this case, we have Ring Shout as a novella. The Merry Spinsters are stories. We had 2 graphic novels this year, Squad and Mooncakes. We have, a spooky Gothic story with Catherine House. We have a historical story. Small spaces with the children's. We always, actually with all of them, we always try to pick a book we know you have in your collections. So in this case, we picked Small Spaces, which is part of a series, which is now complete. We tend to try to have stories for children always as well, with Living Ghosts and Mischievous Monsters this year, which was a big hit with the libraries. It's a scholastic publication of Native American stories that Dan collected and introduces. And then, we have Mooncakes who are here, and then Keith, who's here with Small Zombie Problem, which was chosen for multiple reasons. But one of them is because we do work at StokerCon, and StokerCon was in Pittsburgh this year, and we needed to make sure we had a zombie book. But all of these books have been discussed for many years, and I'm going to talk about that. We meet as a group, we talk about the books, and then we pick them based on sort of a conversation with everyone on the committee. And it changes every year. We have a middle grade expert from Booklist, Julia Smith. We have a YA expert from Book Riot, Kelly Jensen, and then other people that are helping. And we make sure that we talk about the books. We have an agreement. But like Ring Shout, for example, was a semifinal or a honorable mention the year before. And then we obviously elevated it this year to be picked. In the Shadow of Blackbirds was, for a couple of years, we had picked it in 2019 as a sort of like the next in the honorable mention that we would consider the next year. And then the pandemic hit, and we thought a little too on the nose to do for people, but it was coming up to its 10th year. So real quick, just to show you what you get in this free reading guide, besides the fact that all of these authors have done a series of webinars, which are completely free by each age group for Booklist, and you can go to the Booklist website or to the site that Stephanie put in to have everything. Besides the fact that we have a official podcast called Books in the Freezer, where they met with Stephanie from Books in the Freezer, did a podcast for each age level, where they went over the books and they invited other authors to talk about the books. So for middle grade, she invited Ali Malineko, who's a children's book author, a horror middle grade, and a librarian, to talk about them. For adult, she invited Sadie Hartman, otherwise known as Mother Horror, to talk about the books. I forget who she had on for teen, but they're all linked there. For each book, Conrad and his team give you a quick summary, the appeal factors. These are from novelists, because we also work with novelists. A quick book talk. You don't have to read the book to be able to sell it. 4 read-alikes. Sample programs, always, that are ready for you to go. In this case, we do partner with Pitt with their Horror Studies Archives, and they give us a program for 1 book for every age level. In this case, if you contacted us, we could talk to connect you with Pitt, who would help you do a program. And then book discussion questions, so a reading group guide. This was our 5th year doing summer scares. So let's see, we have one for every book. Here's the page for Mooncakes. Same thing. You can take a look at this on your own. And then let's quick do a Small Zombie Problem, which is adorable. All these books are great, but this is my favorite program too. Zombie Family Reunion. I love this program. Conrad's Library is doing a program like this, where they're gonna do art, zombie art. Anyway, and then finally, this year we had an article from Ben Rubin, the Horror Studies Collection Coordinator, to tell you about how they're preserving horror. And that was interesting. We always have one article. And then these are our past authors and books that they have coming out. So next year, all of these authors will be included. So our spokespeople, these are their most recent books. The adult titles we've had before, here are some of our authors and the books they've had come out. Again, these. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to all the authors. And I just want to let you know, that's the program. That's what it is. I would love for you to use them. Here's the thing. We've been doing the program guide for 3 years. This is year 3. You can use any of these guides at any time. You can read these books all year long. You can read books by these authors all year long. And you can definitely use it any time of year for your book clubs. Right now, though, I'm going to let each of these authors introduce themselves a little more. We're going to go in age order. And I would love you to talk about your book that we chose, but also all of your books, what you have coming out, the types of stories you write, and a little bit more about your chosen title. So Fen, you're going to go first.
Hi, everybody. I'm Fenderson Djèlí Clark, also P. Djèlí Clark, which is what they put on my books. I am the author, as it was pointed out, of the novella Ring Shout, which I have here. And this is the Catalan language one because I couldn't find my English copy, but I have wonderful translations. And I was just there in Spain, so here we go. This, like I think it was said, there are great webinars talking about this book and what it's about. And it's basically attempting to use historical fiction with Lovecraftian themes and exploring issues of race and violence in the United States, right? But as you can see here, with lots of open mouths and monstrous creatures. Um, I I suppose I also write beyond that. I write a great deal of other forms of speculative fiction. My works, A Master of Jinn, for instance, is set in an alternate 1900s Cairo, where there is magic, steamship, and Jinn. And so I think people call that alternate steampunk history. I'm not sure what genre they want to place it under. And my most recent work is actually my first middle grade work, right? So, hi, Keith, in your realm now. Uh, my first middle grade work, and it is a secondary fantasy world story about a young girl in a West African type derived setting who becomes an unwitting apprentice after her village is destroyed. But I also have another horror story coming out recently, and I'm glad I remembered this. It is going to be in an anthology of new black horror edited by Jordan Peele. And I am fortunate enough to have a short story in here called Hide and Seek, which actually the main characters in this are actually two young boys who are, I believe, like 10 and 13 or so, and they live in a house of interesting, quirky happenings. And I guess that makes it gothic. I think that's what makes you have a house, it makes it instantly gothic, is what I heard. So, yeah, great to be here.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to mooncakes and Suzanne and Wendy.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Walker. Like I said, I live in Chicago. I'm a writer and editor. Wendy and I created mooncakes together a long time ago now, initially. But on my own, I also write short stories and novels. I have a novel that is an epic fantasy in a secondary world that is currently out on submission right now. And I have a short story in an upcoming Star Wars anthology that's going to be published in August, celebrating the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi. And I think that is most of my solo stuff. So Wendy, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we can talk about mooncakes together.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Wendy Xu. I'm an author, illustrator. I live in Brooklyn. Most of my work is middle grade and young adult fantasy. My most recent book coming out at the end of this month, actually, The Infinity Particle. I have a galley copy to show. Thank you, Fen, for giving me that idea, because like this was right behind me. So this is like tonally a little more somber, a little more, I think, thoughtful. I did a lot of research to make sure that this book would be in conversation with current trends in tech, not just the most recent like stuff on AI, but what I have learned about the tech industry as a result of like trying to world build in a realistic, but also like maybe a little more optimistic way. But Infinity Particle at its heart is a romance about a young inventor and a robot. And hopefully, I mean, every sci-fi author wants to explore themes of humanity, what it means to be a person. And the art style is inspired by my love of manga growing up. And I tried to put, I mean, every book that I have done is different, but I try to really consciously think of like one influence per book. So I have like a little more of a cohesive vision. So for Infinity Particle, it was the teen manga I grew up with. And for my other book, my middle grade Tide Song, which I'll talk briefly about before we get to mooncakes, the a lot of the inspiration was like bright seaside colors and, Studio Ghibli kind of feeling. So apart from these two books, I also have a short story in the sci-fi anthology Tasting Light, which is also about a girl and a robot, but in a very different way. And that's my independent work. So me and Suzanne made mooncakes all the way back in 2016. I think I have like some old photos that popped up on like on this day in Facebook.
Yeah, no, I was getting those too. It was like 7 or 8 years ago now.
Yeah, go ahead, Suze.
Oh yeah, we initially pitched it as, or we didn't pitch it anyway. We started it as a webcomic, and it was us working together with, I was writing the script, Wendy was doing the art, and we were really collaborating on the characters and the world and what we wanted it to really look like and what we wanted the heart of the story to be. And we published the first, I want to say 2 chapters of the webcomic. And then we went on hiatus. And then while we were on hiatus, publishers started reaching out, asking about making it a full graphic novel. And that's sort of how it came about.
I think it's so interesting that me and Suzanne are here because I see like the diverse amount, the kind of books you have on your horror list. But because at the beginning I was like, we don't do horror. This was like a fantasy book. Especially since I try, I can draw scary things. In fact, I love drawing scary things, but I wanted to make the aesthetic of mooncakes a little bit cuter. So none of the monsters, in my opinion, are too scary. But yeah.
So Wendy, that's why we do that too. That's a great point. We try to make sure we have a full range of horror because we're trying to present this at libraries, and we want the libraries to understand that it doesn't all have to be scary, right? Sometimes, especially with the middle grade and the YA, they're looking for sort of the horror tropes, but maybe not being frightened to their core.
I'm sorry to like just jump in with my thoughts, but I just think that's so interesting because to me horror has always meant a very specific thing, but when I guess you are trying to get more books into the hands of people, of course it makes sense you have to broaden those definitions.
Yeah. Also, Wendy, the horse demon that you drew for mooncakes is truly the most frightening thing I have ever seen still to this day. So I think it belongs in horror just for that. Wait, let me see if I can find a copy so that we can show everybody.
There is something.
Great.
Yes, if we want to move on to someone else.
No, it's fine. There is a comment though that it is perfect for people, Darby said, like me, who love a spooky, creepy feeling, but are easily terrified. There's a lot of people who, especially because horror is so popular, want horror to be for them, but it's too much. And so we make sure, since we are setting the standard for the genre for libraries, to say there is so much there that you don't know about and that your readers need to know about. And so we do see our program as a way to introduce it. So we appreciate that you've embraced being considered horror as well. Suzanne, do you have the picture? Because it is.
Yeah, so this is just a shot from the first chapter, and I think it really encapsulates more what the color scheme and aesthetic is for most of the book. And it's very like, again, like embracing sort of a like New England, typical New England town. And then we have this eldritch horror. I don't know if you can see it super well, but it's a horse demon that has 6 legs and a giant eye in the middle. And it's terrorizing the town. And I like described in the script, I was like, giant horse demon. I don't remember what I actually wrote, but I think that most of it was just Wendy's design, and she came back to me with it. I was like, this is terrifying.
I am going to move on to Keith for a moment, but that was great. I do have one more comment I want to make sure everyone sees. I agree, Wendy. Horror books always had a spooky genre feel for me, and I never considered non-spooky horror as an actual thing. So let's go, and it is. Keith, now this is a great segue actually to your book and your series and the books you write, because you are writing for a middle grade audience. They're still terrifying though, but in different ways.
Yeah. Hi, I'm KG Campbell. Keith is my name. I go by KG because partly because I don't like my first name, and partly because I think KG Campbell makes me sound smarter than I am. You probably know me more as a picture book author and illustrator. That's how I got my break into the industry as an illustrator. I think I have about 8 picture books on the market, including Lester's Dreadful Sweaters and The Mermaid and the Shoe, which are my 2 best known. But you probably know me most as the illustrator of Kate DiCamillo's Flora and Ulysses, which was made into a Disney movie recently. But I've actually always thought of myself more as an author who can draw rather than an illustrator who can write. So I always had my eye on writing longer format stuff. And so the zombie series came along as a result of that. It was inspired by a story that my husband told me, actually, my husband and his sister. I'm an only child, so I've always been very interested in sibling dynamics. And he had a slightly older sister who was probably about 14 or 15. He was maybe 11 or 12. He was in an awkward stage, changing schools, not very happy, slightly overweight. So he was following his sister around with her cool friends, and all she wanted to do was get rid of her younger brother. So she locked herself in her room and thought she was being really smart by climbing out the window to avoid him. But there he was at the bottom waiting for her. And she said, "Oh my God, you're such a zombie. Why do you always have to follow me around?" And that is where the story came from. It's basically about a kid who is trying to make friends for the first time in his life, because he's lived a very isolated life that is explained in the book. He basically has an agoraphobic caregiver, and they live in this crumbling mansion. He eventually has the opportunity to go out into the world, and he meets some relatives he didn't know even existed. He has some cousins. But on his very first trip into the outside world, he manages to activate a zombie, which happens to be the remains of his own great aunt. Now, she was only 11 years old when she died. So she winds up looking something like this. Well, this is her. So that's sort of the main plot surrounds this kid trying to make friends. He watches this TV show called Stella Stars in her own life. And he sees this sort of perfect world where a tween has this zany life with crazy friends and lots of adventures. It's everything that he wants. And so he goes in search of this life in the real world, but is constantly hampered by this single zombie. And as the series progresses, more and more zombies come into the picture. And there's a deep family secret in the whole thing that explains why the zombies are following him. But beyond the plot, it's actually kind of an ode to childhood loneliness, because I was a very lonely kid, and I wrote it for all the other lonely kids out there who are trying to find a way to fit in. So that's kind of the heart of the story. And then beyond that, now what I'm doing these days is I'm working on my first adult novel, which is what I call fantastorical. Hello, fan. It's 95% diligently researched history and about 5% fantasy. And it's actually a same-sex romance set in the age of Darwin. Haven't sold it yet, but I'm working on it with my agent. So it's still in the early stages, but that's been keeping me busy for the last few months.
So you will literally span everything because you'll have the picture books up to it all. You'll have to put a teen novel in there.
I'm working my way up. I still have to fit in a YA at some point.
Yeah, you still need a teen novel. And you actually have a great segue because you mentioned how, the story is really for the lonely kids. And I want to go back to Fen because one of the reasons the committee, well, we all loved your book. I mean, I put it on Library Journal's Best Horror of the year it came out. I was not alone. But all of you, and we're going to start with Fen, use horror to look at some fairly serious things that are not just, you're looking at issues that go beyond just, I want to scare people. And in your case, Fan Ringshout is a very serious look at the Ku Klux Klan, the overt American racism that led to a lot of violence. And I also love the Lovecraftian twist, since we all know he was a total jerk and hated anybody. I mean, I'm a woman and Jewish. He hated me a lot, right? He hated you a lot. Like, I know this. And there's a lot of us. We've actually done this before. We had The Ballad of Black Tom as one of our books, which looked at the similar issue. So I want to ask all of you, but starting with Fen, why use horror specifically as a lens to look at the issues you do want to look at in your stories?
No, that's a great question. And, you know, for me, the origins of it lay that I'm an academic historian. I actually teach a class called Slavery and Film. And so, you know, central to Ring Shout is The Birth of a Nation. And, you know, I showed that film. And so there was a lot of inspiration in using the film as a really powerful device within the book, because historically we know the film pretty much restarts the Ku Klux Klan, right? It makes it a larger organization than it had ever been from coast to coast in the United States in the early 1900s, during this era of a great deal of racial violence, the Red Summer of 1919 that people think of, the Tulsa Race Massacre. All these things are happening around this time period. And so I think I used horror in the way that when you look back at a lot of early Black authors have done, in using horror in a way to talk about racial trauma, right? I always use this joke where I always say, like, you know, when it came to things that Black people were afraid of, like Freddie and Jason were fine, but it was actually the racism. was actually much more terrible and much more horrible and much more real life, right? And so I saw this as a great way to explore that. And then I also got to play around with the Lovecraftian thing, because as you pointed out, Lovecraft was quite a lot, right? In his multiple forms of hatred that he had. And, you know, how do I reconcile the fact that I understand that he was a very hateful person? I don't mean hateful like in my grandfather has some peculiar ideas about, you know, the Negro's propensity for dancing. I mean, like, actually exterminationist, really hateful ideologies. The guy read Mein Kampf and praised it, right? So, you know, I was like, how do I still use some of those themes? Because who doesn't like tentacles? How do I still use some of those themes while also acknowledging what he is and talking through all of this? And so that's how Ring Shot came about, a hodgepodge of that, me growing up in the South with Southern hip hop, Beyonce's Formation video is an inspiration, work I had done when I was getting my master's on the ex-slave narratives, where I first heard former slaves speaking of this, as they were talking about after the Civil War, the rise of the first Klan, and thinking of the Klan as monsters, right, as haints. And so all of that kind of came together into this book, and horror seemed the best way to explore it. Though I want to say, like, I think something Wendy said earlier, when I first started, I don't know I was thinking horror, probably because my mind is sick and I'm like, I'm just telling a fantasy story. It's got monsters, it's got heroine with a sword, it's a fantasy story. Right? And then people were like, this is pretty horrific. And so I said, oh, I guess it's also horror, sure. And so I like the fact that you choose these books for their horror content. That's how people saw it. But I said, it's interesting, when I first started writing, I don't know I had a specific genre in mind.
You know, in general, as we're dealing with libraries, which is something I know we've talked about in the different things we've done all year, but in libraries, we have our readers that like their genres. Oh, we got a visitor. We have, we like
the Castle Dragon, everyone.
Oh, that's right. Stephanie asked about the dragon. Nice. We do talk about, in libraries, we have our hardcore fans who love specific genres. Yes, but most of our readers just are looking for good stories. And our job in the library is to be that discovery layer for them, right? To help them find the stories that they would like to read, not based on what they think they like or the things they already know, but what they don't know about yet, right? books that they would like if only they knew about them. And I saw some of the reactions as everyone was talking about their books. We're already getting reactions in the chat of like, I want to read this. Oh my goodness, I want to read this. So I think and that's what we do with Summer Scares, right? We provide that discovery layer. So going on to Wendy and Suzanne, who you already talked about this a little. So although it's more on the dark fantasy side, there are horror elements, as Suzanne proved with that terrifying picture. Why go that little bit darker, scarier route to tell the story you wanted to tell? How was the story better served by that? Suzanne is muted.
I'm muted. I'm so sorry. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, just because, as Wendy said, when we first got the email asking if we'd be part of this, I was gratified, but also surprised, because I don't think of it as a horror story. And I think that overall it is still a, like, as you said, like darker fantasy, but also there are parts of it that are not very dark at all. Like most people, when they talk to me, they talk about how warm it feels to them. But when I was thinking about the horror aspects, like obviously there's the horse, but the horse is more of a visual and is kind of the MacGuffin of the story. And the thing that I find the most horrific, and the thing that I really delved into in the script that is horrific, is the moments at the end when we find out about these werewolf hunters that have been hunting Tam, the main character, who is one of the main characters who is a non-binary werewolf. And it turns out that there's this cult that has been pursuing them and traps them. And the forces behind that I find to be the most insidious part of the book, because the two leaders of the cult are Tam's stepfather, who they never had a very good relationship with and who do not accept Tam, and an authority figure in Tam's life who they really looked up to and trusted. And I think that sort of insidiousness of adults in children's lives who wind up being these really malicious forces is a really horrifying thing, and not something that really gets discussed a lot, and certainly doesn't really get discussed a lot when people talk about mooncakes. But it was a really, like, I did that purposefully, and I think that is a really, like, horrifying thing. And I think that, it has a happy ending, but a lot of horror stories have happy endings. So sorry, we'll just be rambling at this point.
I'm going to let Wendy go in a second, but I think
Yes.
that's important to point out. The committee really loved how the story did deal with those real life horrors, much like Fenderson's book did too. But you did a little bit of lightening of it with the horror elements, almost lighten it a little, right? The color palette is not overwhelmingly dark. It is, it brings some fun to the story and some moments of just, I don't want to say joy, because it's not really joy, but it does help make people see themselves in the story more, which is really important for YA, while still discussing very serious issues. Wendy, how did you work with the art to sort of make sure you're balancing that tone?
Well, I had a lot of input into the plot as well, so both of us kind of hammered out like everything. Of course, with the art elements, those were mostly up to me, but I simply must say that we got into a whole thing the other week on Twitter about cozy horror and whether like cozy horror was a thing. And I think I don't want to call it cozy horror. I don't really like that term. I think that's completely kind of antithetical to horror, because even though Mooncakes has been described as a cozy story, as a like get up in a blanket, read some, have some hot chocolate. I think of Mooncakes, I never thought of it as a horror. I thought of it as like a dark, like when I'm thinking of a palette, I'm not so much thinking, especially for Mooncakes, when I think of the palette, I really wanted to put the daytime colors of fall. So like the three primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, really present in just the colors of fall, right? Leaves and sky. That's what makes fall so memorable. So for Mooncakes, that is what I tried to do with the palette, with regards to the art, like the physical features of the characters. I mean, the scariest thing to me about Mooncakes was our main antagonist, who, like, no offense to all the white ladies here, but like is a total Karen with a North Face. I saw a lot of those in the town where I grew up in New England. And it was a whole uniform at the school I went to. But
The blonde bob haircut.
yes, yeah, like the can I speak to the manager haircut, like these things to me are the scariest parts of our antagonist, your friendly neighborhood Karen who secretly hates you. So like the horse design was just me being like, I'm terrified of horses, what if it had 6 legs? But I think I put more effort into like the just straddling the line on this character's face between like she looks nice enough, but she also looks vaguely menacing. I know people were like, well, it's like easy to guess like the villain from just the way she was drawn, and I was like, well, good, because like she's supposed to be a little not nicer, I want to say, but I think that the scariest themes of Mooncakes are the kind of unspoken ones. The cult.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always fascinated by cults. It's always like, what are you interested in when we're writing? I just really love to learn about cults. So
Cults is like a whole subgenre of horror that people love as well, because they are horrifying. And this is why I think what we're trying to showcase here, Wendy and Suzanne, especially, that people classify this book as horror, but really the horror in this book is the real life horror. And we have some werewolf, witch, we have some of the tropes, right, that we can see that people identify as horror. And that is really important because a lot of horror uses real life horror. In fact, the biggest trend in horror is the horror written by people with marginalized perspectives, who are taking the horror, oh, we got another pet, taking the horror of real life and putting it there in a way that, and I think Fenderson talked about this, with using Lovecraft's own racism and horribleness to tell a story. And we're going to get to Keith in a minute, and he uses that whole idea of being the super lonely child as well, and how isolating that is. The horror here is in something we can identify as a trope that people will see, but really the books we choose all have something deeper at their core, like most horror does. We're trying to, help people understand that the genre is for everyone. I do want to say, I also agree that I don't like the term cozy horror as well. It's one of those terms. It's also like literary horror. My editors at Library Journal and Booklist know that if they ever put the word literary in front of the word horror in one of my reviews, I will quit that day. I talk about it all the time with Stephen Graham Jones, because he's like, I write horror. You put literary in front of it because it's won awards or it's about issues. No, all horror can be about issues, right? And when you put literary in front of any genre, you demean the rest of the genre. So cozy horror does the same thing. It's just a way, I think people were trying to say this book won't scare you to pieces. But I don't think that's necessarily true with Mooncakes, because there is some horrible stuff that happens that is, like you said, very scary. So yeah, that's like a whole thing. I like to talk about different scare levels in terms of violence, and like Ring Shout has a lot of violence. It's really fun because they're killing all the Ku Klux Klan hates, and I really like it, but it's violent. Whereas Mooncakes is slightly less. But we do have titles that are, across the board. Going into Keith then, and if I'm going to say this out loud, I put in the chat, Fenderson has to leave in a few minutes. So if you have a question specifically for him, get it in now so that he can just go when it's time to leave. But Keith, if you would like to talk about your book and why you did it a little bit, but let's talk about it a little more, why you thought the zombie trope was a great way to tell this very serious story about a very truly lonely child.
Well, actually, in my case, it worked out the other way around. I mean, I started with the idea, the inspiration that I explained earlier. And when I first came up with the idea, which was probably at least 10 years ago, zombies were really hot. And so I wanted to write a book about zombies. And as I explored the the plot and amped up the sort of drama. Why was this kid so desperate to make friends? He had to be isolated in the first place, so that at 12 years old, he has no friends, he has no experience. So he then, by necessity, then I had to make him sort of isolated in these circumstances. And it evolved into a story about a kid who was very lonely. And then I started drawing on very personal experiences, and it became a much deeper and more emotional journey for me as well. And when I first set out, like everyone else, I did not really intend to make it a horror story, even though it was about zombies. It was a little bit more of a tribute to Gothic fiction, and I even did quite a lot of research into Gothic fiction. There's obviously some debate about what the difference between Gothic and horror is. I think most people would agree that Gothic literature is the parent of horror, but what makes it Gothic, to me at least, is slightly less overt, frightening aspects to it. Certainly less violence, less gore, and a lot of atmosphere, a lot of sinister atmosphere. So the setting in particular, as Ben was saying earlier about you have a house suddenly in Gothic, I mean, I was very inspired because it is about zombies. Like I researched zombies, found out that they're nothing to do with brain-eating monsters or a virus. They actually come from voodoo. So now you're talking voodoo, you're keeping it in the States, and you're in Louisiana, basically, right? So even though the setting is not actually specified, it's all very heavily inspired by Louisiana. So I tried to pour as much of that atmosphere as I could into it. Yeah, that's where that is.
Well, what we've heard back from people too about this series is that the kids are really drawn to it, because I think that what you've done is created a story that's very relatable, right, to any kid who's ever felt lonely, which is every kid, right? And well, maybe not Fenn's kids because they're twins, so they have each other. But every kid's felt lonely, and it's just a really great way to be like, well, this is a different way to tell that story. And it does have humor as well.
Yeah, look, there's all sorts of different levels of horror, as you guys know. Obviously, you're doing all the age groups. So of the people here, mine is the youngest and probably the least scary. And there is a lot of humor. There's a lot of gross middle grade humor, eyeballs constantly being offered as a gift. Limbs get torn off and then used for other repurposement of limbs, caterpillars crawling out of noses, that kind of thing. So there's that gross, funny aspect to pull the kids in and expose them to a little bit of scariness, because, you know, I think building up our immunity to fear is important for kids, because they're at a point in their life where they reach a point in their life where they want to experience all the feels, right? They're growing up and growing physically and growing emotionally, and growing emotionally requires us to feel everything. And so I think something like that is a good on-ramp to horror. It's less in your face. I also think that horror literature is great for kids at that age, because unlike a movie, they can put it down. If it gets too much for them, they can set it aside and they can come back to it. There's nothing gonna leap out at them and scare the pants out of them. So it's kind of, you know, it's a good way for them to callous that aspect of their emotional development.
I want to talk about that, but I want to ask Fenn if he had anything else he wanted to say before he left.
No, just thank you. Sorry I have to break. Pediatrician appointment. Again, you know how hard those are to come by. But thank you for having me here. Great conversation. Please, everybody, continue. And if you get a chance, check out the middle grade book, Benny's Song. It's out now. It's got some scary parts in it. It does.
Buy all of his books.
All right.
Bye. I want to talk about, I just put in the chat, because you brought up something really important. And now that we have the YA and the middle grade author here, we can talk about this more, horror for kids. So one of the reasons we started Summer Scares was we knew that kids and teens were reading horror. We knew this, right? And we were starting to see one of the reasons we're in this current horror renaissance with all these authors and books is that we have readers coming up to becoming adults who have started with scary stories to tell in the dark, or even like, R.L. Stine, and then went up through YA, where there's some excellent choices for horror. And the middle grade, I mean, my goodness, we had last year's book, Scary Stories for Young Foxes, was a Newbery Award finalist, right? An honor book. These are books that, and Beetle and Hollow Bones was a Stonewall Award winner in the children's category. We're talking about award-winning titles here. And so those people are coming up with those stories and they want to read more. And we wanted to make sure they were being highlighted. Also, we saw this is year 5 for Summer Scares. The popularity went through the roof. With this last year, we gave out the first ever, and I have a link to the Bram Stoker Awards for the Horror Writers Association. We gave out the first ever middle grade award for horror. We've had a YA award for many years. And it went to Daniel Kraus for his Teddy series, the second one. I believe the second one's called They Stole Our Hearts. But we had the Clackety, we had Disappearing House, we had all these books, Comb of Wishes that are, and then Camp Scare? That might be one of this year's books. We had great books. You can see it all there, the winners or the nominees and the winners. And Conrad and I actually got to give the award on stage, which was really fun that we got to give it to Daniel because he's been our spokesperson all year for Summer Scares. So that was very exciting. But the point I'm trying to make is kids want to be scared. Kids are dealing with these issues, like Keith was saying, like Suzanne and Wendy were talking about with their story. Life is terrifying when you're a child and you're just starting to figure it out as you grow up. Horror is a great place to do that. And so we're not only hoping that you add these books to your libraries, but you give them out all year long to people and use them for programming and book discussions. And like I said, we have multiple years of librarian vetted titles that you can be confident to add to your collections, and that, you will, that they will get readers and that they are well received. And we have awards to back them up. Now, to ask those of you who are here still, I would love for you to talk about any interactions you had this summer with libraries, or anything that being part of Summer Scares made you rethink about working with libraries and about the work you do in general. So we'll go back to Suzanne and Wendy.
Yeah. So I did not get to do as much as I would have liked this summer. I had an unexpected surgery procedure at the beginning of May, and then I got COVID. So my participation was not as robust as I would have liked, but it's been a really great opportunity to engage more with libraries and to remember kind of my own experiences with libraries as a kid, because I spent so much time in my local public library when I was a little kid and up through being a young adult. And it's just been really nice to sort of connect and find out what kids are going in and reading, and finding out what kinds of things they're interested in, because I have 0 children in my life and I have no idea what they're all into right now. So it's nice to know, and it's just been really gratifying to even know that people are still reading Mooncakes. We published it 4 years ago, which is a long time ago now, and it's been really gratifying to just know that people are still reading it and know that people are still loving it.
Well, libraries operate with that backlist, right? The most books we have are not the new books. And so we are always looking for reasons to take good books and get them back in front of people. And so I love, that's the number one ththing we hear from authors who participate, Suzanne, is I forget that my older books are still being read. And we love that we're bringing back books. Again, we focus on 2 to 8 years ago, 2 to 10 max. We try to go in that 2 to 5 ideally. What about you, Wendy, for this summer?
Well, this summer I did a program at the Darien Public Library, which was absolutely lovely. And because the elementary school I was supposed to have a visit at initially canceled on me for no reason, citing quote unquote adult content. What adult content? Children deal with these things all the time, as you said, queerness and being a racial minority and all of these things, that's not something you can escape from. So thankfully the Darien Public Library folks stepped in to correct the elementary school's short-sightedness. So I was able to do a really great visit, do an art workshop with the kids. And yeah, I was just, I have been thinking about like horror a lot, specifically with regards to the recent conversation about cozy horror, which again, I do not like as a term. A lot of times, especially because see, like when there's a webinar like this, like when it's run by a library, when the goal is to kind of get more books into the hands of readers, period, it's a little less cynical than trying to invalidate a children's book for kids for that reader audience by calling it cozy, meaning like not very hard, and trying to make it okay for adults to read kids books. You can read a children's book as a grown-up, it's fine, no one will care if you do that. But the most important thing for me as a co-creator on Mooncakes and as a creator of children's fiction in general is that kids get to read and think and grapple with these tough issues through the lens of fantasy. I've always been a fantasist. I've always just liked to use metaphor instead. Like, I don't make a lot of autobiographical work because it has to be sublimated under a lens of like dragons or something. And I think a lot of artists do this. I saw a question about horror manga, and yes, Junji Ito is great, but I highly encourage you to check out books from smaller manga presses such as Glacier Bay Books and Starfruit Press. Those are both two really small presses. Some have ebooks if your library has an ebook collection, but the small press comics people are really doing the best work out there, both overseas and over here. So another small press I love is Piao. They have several really amazing anthologies. They have a beautiful book called A Frog in the Fall. But yeah, those are the publications doing some like truly avant-garde work in all genres. Piao has a dark fantasy issue. That's like one of their books they do compendiums by tons and tons of comics artists. But yeah, I grew up reading R.L. Stine in the library. So I think that this is a really great opportunity and very, very like, what is the opposite of cynical? Like kind,
Thank you.
Yeah,
And I was gonna thank you for taking that question because I was gonna ask you to take the horror manga question after we did this. I'll get to you in a second, Keith, but I do want to say, Wendy, thank you for sharing that story. Hot tip little here. The director of the Darien Public Library was one of the original committee members of Summer Scares as well. So she is a friend to the community, but we do go out of our way to have queer representation. We make sure we have a lot of racial representation, but we have gone out of our way. We have queer representation on the committee, and we make sure that the books have queer representation. We have a trans author this year as well. We did Beetle and Hollowbones last year specifically because it won the Stonewall. We knew it was being targeted and being banned. Maggie Takuta Hall, who did a book also that's in Summer Scares this year, had very publicly was against Scholastic for trying to censor her book for dealing with racism, which was ironic because it was about anti-Asian issues. And last year's Summer Scares spokesperson was Alma Katsu, whose book was all about internment, and her entire platform was about racial hate and specifically about internment. So in fact, Alma came to Maggie's defense and helped her with a lot of her. So we're a big Summer Scares family. We like to say once a Summer Scares author, always a Summer Scares author. And we are about promoting the good. And we know with children, especially, queerness is an issue that we need to make sure in the books because, like you said, they can't run from it. Keith, what about you? I forgot what our topic was. What were we talking about?
I've done the stuff with you guys, these forums, and I did a couple of Zooms with libraries. I don't have their names to hand. I apologize. I can't remember which the ones they were, but it's always great to interact with the kids.
The kids love your book. They have so many great responses. We've gotten some from some of the libraries as well.
Good. I particularly like it when they give me advice. One of them told me that he did not appreciate cliffhangers at the end of every chapter because it made him keep reading longer than he wanted to. Another told me he didn't like the fact it was a trilogy because he didn't want to have to read 3 books in order to find out the ending. But I was congratulated by somebody else on my story arc. She felt that I had tied up all the loose ends very well. So
Kids are the best. Kids are the best.
I do enjoy the 11-year-old literary critiques.
And that is what I know the children's librarians out there have a lot to say about that because they get that feedback as well. If we don't, does anyone else have any other manga they want to share? Some horror manga? Manga is extremely popular in libraries. And Wendy, you're right. There's a lot of e-content. And when I worked in the teen room at my library, I could not keep the manga. Like I bought everything that was available that I had special shelves. It is extremely popular. And I think it's coming back again in a more of a mainstream because I know people probably saw, but Junji Ito went to Comic-Con and there were no movies and TV this year. So it was all about books and there was a lot of interest in getting more horror manga. So,
well, I mean,
more, yes.
I think that specifically Junji Ito's Frankenstein should be read side by side or along Mary Shelley's version, just because the visual choices he makes are so interesting and could be like a really good teen program. I'm also a teacher. I do an after-school comics program, so I'm always like, oh, this would be a great thing to do with the students. I don't think Chainsaw Man is horror, but it's like it's an action manga and it's pretty gory. A lot of middle schoolers love it, even though, they're not supposed to. They will read up. So Chainsaw Man is great. I'm like looking at my own shelf. It's not, again, these are all things I consider dark fantasy. You guys can label it whatever you want. XXX Holic by Clamp, CLAMP. Holic was one of my favorite titles growing up because it's spooky and atmospheric. It's black and white. It deals with a kid who works at a store that will grant you any wish, and the clients range from humans who have been like supernaturally touched to yokai and other spirits. XXX Holic is just like my favorite.
I'm gonna pause you for a second
and
let other people jump in because we're running out of time. Are there any other books or authors that you want to promote to the librarians here? Because all these library workers have money to spend on books. So let me go to you, Keith, first. Anything you think people should be reading in any level or any genre?
I don't really have any new books to recommend, but some of my favorite ones, I don't know if people know, because I don't hear people talk about it a lot, is Chris Priestley's Uncle Montague's Tales of Terror, which is also a trilogy, but it's a trilogy of anthologies. It's just short stories. But although each book is sandwiched in a sort of larger story, but it's illustrated by David Roberts, who's a brilliant British illustrator who's very inspired by Edward Gorey, at least at this point of his career. And they're really dark. The protagonist of every short story meets a sticky end, usually based on their own flaws and failings. So that's one.
I like this one.
Beyond that, I mean, probably my favorite middle grade horror book is Coraline.
Such a great book.
Neil Gaiman. I love everything that Neil Gaiman does. And much of his stuff could ostensibly fall into the horror genre, but is more dark fantasy as well.
I literally jumped out of my seat the morning that The Graveyard Book, I was at work, was named the Newbery Award winner, because I was like, finally, a book that starts with murder and a dripping knife is winning the Newbery. This is what kids want to read, right?
Yeah.
Entire family's murdered and the baby is going to be raised by ghosts, Jungle Book style, and it's amazing. We are up at time, so Suzanne, do you have anything you would like people to try or maybe put in their libraries?
A friend of mine just came out with a new book called The Archive Undying. It's by Emma Mako Candon. And if you like mech stuff, if you loved Pacific Rim and you thought, what if you made the mechs even more fucked up and sad and queer, then this book is for you. I highly recommend it. It was amazing. I tore through it. And Keith, your story about the 11-year-olds reminded me, I found when I was going through some of my old school stuff this weekend, my very first author fan letter that I wrote to Megan Whalen Turner about the Queen of Atolia. And it was in 2002 that I wrote this, and she's since published like 4 more stories in the series. So if you have not checked out the Queen's Thief series, it is secondary world fantasy, lots of political stuff. It's great. I love it. It had a really formative influence on me as a writer.
I love it. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the audience. You did great participation and comments. And again, I'm going to put it in the chat before I throw it over to Stephanie. Libraries@horror.org. I think Lauren is on, and she commented at the beginning that we hooked her up with Grady Hendrix last year. Again, any of our Summer Scares authors are available. She is doing a program with former Summer Scares author Clay McLeod Chapman and a different New Jersey horror author named Tim Myers later in the year at her library. But you use email that. It goes to 3 of us at the Horror Writers Association who can help us definitely get you authors, whether virtual or in person in your libraries. Wendy, what do you want us to make a recommendation?
Okay, so my good friend Ethan Aldridge wrote an upcoming book called Deep Haven. It's very spooky, very atmospheric, middle grade, about some kids at a cursed New England boarding school. And the last book, I'm sorry, I read so many.
We love it. We love them.
Is Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. It's
a good book.
It's shortlisted for the Booker Prize, just an absolutely banger anthology of all different types of genres. She's got horror, she's got fantasy, she's got a human centipede robot story that has really messed me up. So I highly recommend you check out Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung.
The highest praise for any horror book. It really messed me up. I like to say that when I throw it to Stephanie, like Stephen Graham Jones is The Only Good Indians. It's one of the best books I've read this century, and it makes me terrified of ceiling fans. Go read it for yourself now. Stephanie, thank you for having us.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you, KG, Wendy, and Suzanne. It's been so lovely to have you guys here. It's such a great conversation too, so I really appreciate you all taking the time.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks,
Everybody.
Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.